Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Hope City Church. My name is Peter. I'm the pastor here. Thrilled that you guys are here as we continue in our series called Fixer Upper. We've been taking a look at what do we do when there's some things in our world that needs a little bit of tweaking here and there. So we are continuing that, and as you heard from Kevin, today we're going to be talking about the idea of discouragement. Well, that is the most fun topic to talk about, right? Like, nobody's like, woo, we get to talk about discouragement all day. Focus on the things that we're discouraged about. No, actually, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to focus on the things that we're discouraged about. We're going to talk about how do we overcome discouragement. This past week, I met up with a group of area pastors. We gather together about once a quarter from all kind of the southwest Florida region, and we got together, and it was somebody's brilliant idea that let's go meet at a driving range, okay? Let's go actually to Topgolf, where we make that into a competition, where we can actually score who is the best at hitting a golf ball. Some of you in this room are really, really good at that. I applaud you, but only in like a golf clap kind of a way. Me, on the other hand, I have zero golf talent, zero golf abilities. I'm pretty sure that's like a club, even though I would think of it more like a bat, but whatever, it doesn't matter. So I came to this event, and we're like hanging out, talking with one another, and they're like, "Oh, you're up next," and I'm like, "No, I'm good. I'm in a deep conversation," and I think all in total, I hit about 18 golf balls that day because I'm just that good at golf. But with the 18 that I did hit, if you've ever been to Topgolf, you know how there's like the red hole that's right, like literally it falls off of the upper deck and it goes in that hole. That's where most of my balls went, if they even went in the hole. So to say that I was a little bit discouraged that day is fair. That's a very, very fair statement. But here's what I know to be true. I know that there have been other times in my life where discouragement creeps in and it finds root in my heart, where discouragement can actually begin to overwhelm or can capture all of my attention. And I know that I'm not the only person. I know that there are little things, and it's even something as simple as a golf swing, right? It's something as simple and in some ways meaningless as a golf swing. It doesn't take something that's profound or has this kind of life-changing capability to become discouraged over. And this is where many of us find ourselves. We find ourselves waking up in the morning discouraged about the place that we are. And so, as we'll see in the book of Nehemiah that we've been studying and we've been talking and working our way through the story of Nehemiah, you will find that we aren't the only ones that deal with discouragement. We aren't the first people who have had to kind of raise our hand and say, yeah, it actually feels kind of crummy right now. In fact, Nehemiah, he dealt with this because if you'll remember, from the beginning of this book, Nehemiah is this Old Testament leader who his heart was broken. In week 1, we said, what does your heart break for? What are the things in the world around us that your heart breaks for? What is God breaking your heart? Or what in your world needs to be repaired? That's another way of looking at that. Well, in Nehemiah's world, he saw that the walls of Jerusalem, that kind of the capital city of God's chosen people, they were broken down. They were kind of laying in ruins, crumbled. The walls were broken, just kind of a whole bunch of stones. The gates were burned by fire, so they're just, ash pieces of wood laying around. All of the doors, the hardware is just kind of laying where it burnt to the ground. And his heart broke over that. This is about 445 BC. And so he goes to the king and he's like, "King, can I go and fix these walls?" And the king sends him off. King Artaxerxes sends him off with supplies, sends him off with manpower, and sends him off with letters to be able to walk 1,000 miles through the different provinces with protection from the king. And yet, Nehemiah, as you'll see today, you'll find that he is actually an incredibly discouraged person in these next few verses. However, he deals with discouragement in a way that allows him to move forward. See, Jerusalem was such a mess that it was not even a fixer-upper. This was like a down-and-outer. This was like, there's nothing we could do for this. And yet, Nehemiah cast a vision. He stood before the people and was like, we can do better than this. Look at what Nehemiah said to these people and what was taking place in chapter 3 of Nehemiah. That's on page 330 of the Bibles around you. Or you can flip over in your YouVersion app, or maybe you brought your Bible along with you today. But check out Nehemiah chapter 3, and it'll be on the screens behind me as well. It says that Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. So this is what's happening in chapter 3. We find that these guys are getting back to work. Last week we talked about some of the different gates that he saw. This is the sheep gate in modern day Jerusalem right now. And this was a place where shepherds, they would bring sheep through this gate in order to be sacrificed at the temple. And so they would have this whole thing. And this was very significant, that one of the very first gates that they rebuilt was the sheep gate, because that was symbolizing that this was the spiritual priority of the city, to be able to go and continue to sacrifice, to have a right relationship with God in that day and age. And so they rebuilt the sheep gate. And then in verse 3, it says that the fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassenaah. They laid its beams and put its doors and its bolts and bars in place. Now, obviously, the fish gate is a bit of what you would think it is. This is where the fishermen from the Sea of Galilee would bring their catch in, and they would sell that there to be used. And these gates, these beams, they were, enormous doors, and the bolts and the bars, all these things. This was some serious construction. This isn't kind of like a light remodel. This is a fixer-upper of epic proportions. If you guys spend some time in Nehemiah chapter 3 this week, if you read through it all the way, you will see that these aren't professional contractors either. These are ordinary people. Look at this. In verse 8, it says that Uzziel, son of Hariah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section. And Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. Like, if you're calling to have your stone wall rebuilt, you're probably not calling a goldsmith, definitely not calling a perfume maker, but although it probably smelled the best. But it was like this, that was what was happening. They were pulling together all of these people to rebuild this wall. The city was beginning to rise from the ashes after it had sat there for 140 years broken down. See, in your world today, there very well may be something that has sat untouched, that has sat broken for several years. Some of you may even say, this is actually picking like at a scab. Like, I don't want to deal with this because it's just like the grass has grown over the issue. I don't want to talk about this. And yet, this is exactly where they found themselves. They were rebuilding the city after it was broken for 140 years. Now, each story goes on in verse 13 when the valley gate was repaired. The residents of Zanoah, they rebuilt it, and they put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. They also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. See, we see all of these very important details here, because what we see here is they've put together about 1,500 feet. 1,000 cubits is about the equivalent of 1,500 feet of wall, and they rebuilt this. And as they're rebuilding, the people around them start to take notice, because right now you're like, wait, aren't we talking about discouragement? This seems pretty good. This actually seems pretty encouraging. Like, if I'm thinking about rebuilding a wall, I'm not rebuilding 1,500 feet of wall, right? But no sooner did these guys start to rebuild the wall, then all of the haters start coming out. All of the critics start coming out, and they start throwing shade at Nehemiah, right? They're mocking the Israelites. Actually, the very first case of this is in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19. Look at this. We are introduced to a couple guys. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us, as if saying, like, what is this you're doing? They asked. Like, what are you even doing? Why are you doing this? See, these three guys are local, kind of provincial governors around the city of Jerusalem. These three guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they were political opponents of Israel. And so they didn't want the walls going up. They didn't want to see, this city of Jerusalem kind of come back to life. In fact, they were saying, we need to keep the Jews broken and dependent on us. Frankly, they were trying to guard their own power and their own financial stability. Now, for some of you, it could be that throughout this series that God's put something on your heart. When I said, what breaks your heart? What are the things that breaks your heart that you want to see change? And some of you were like, you know what, I want to change some financial patterns. I want to get out of debt. And you decided to go all Dave Ramsey on it. You got a tattoo of Dave on your arm, and like you were doing the cash envelope thing. And then all of a sudden what happens is your car breaks down. And you bring it, and it's like $780. And boom, there's opposition that happens to what you set up. Maybe you're trying to rebuild your family, and you felt convicted that you need to be the spiritual leader in your home. You need to be the spiritual leader that your family needs. And so you came home one day, you sat down with the family and said, hey, you know what, we're gonna pray together. We're going to serve on the dream team together. We're going to join a connect group together. And at dinner that day, your teenager says, hey, you know what, I don't know if I really buy this whole God thing anymore. And all you can see is they're building this other kind of social world around them. Opposition, discouragement sets in. Maybe you're a boss or a businesswoman, and you've set up your own business. You've decided that you're going to run your business on God's principles, on principles of integrity and honesty. And yet there are some key leaders in your organization surrounding you that's saying, this is a waste of time. We could have so much more money, so much more profit if we would kind of cut some quarters, if we did this, and this. We could make more money, do more, and then more opposition in the workplace. See, it's funny. You would think, sometimes people think that the moment that you become a Christian or you decide to follow Christ with your life, that, you know what, that God is going to just bless you. You think, well, I've got God's blessing, God's backing behind me, and you think it's going to be smooth sailing from here. Guys, let me tell you, that is not the Christian life. You don't understand the Christian life if that's what you think is going to happen. Because here's what I know. I know that every single person, no matter who you are, no matter what political influence, what kind of power, what your bank account says, what your family name is, every single person in this room has a Sanballat, has a Tobiah, and has, this other guy, Geshem, in your life. Everybody has these people in your world. Why? Because these are the people that mock you and ridicule you for whatever it is that you're passionate about. See, we've got these in our life. The Christian life, it's not a playground. It's not this idea that once we start following Christ with our life, that everything is just great. No, the Christian life is actually more of a battleground. See, believers have a spiritual enemy called the devil. We believe that the Bible talks about, heaven, and it talks about the forces of good and the forces of evil. It talks about God and his opponent, Satan. And see, our spiritual enemy is not threatened when we just kind of go along with the status quo. Like, he's threatened when we step out to do something right. When you step out and you said, today's the day that I'm going to make a change. Today is the day that I live by the conviction that we talked about last week. Today's that day. Guess what? That's when opposition attacks. That's when opposition goes full force, kind of full court press into your life. Understand something, that if you are walking with Christ and you have this spiritual life that you're trying to take these next steps, I want you to know that you don't face opposition when you're doing something wrong. Opposition in your life doesn't come because you're doing something wrong. In fact, you face opposition very often when you're doing something right. When you're stepping up to do something big, something bold for God, criticism comes, and criticism is often confirmation that you're on the right track because the enemy is threatened. Our spiritual enemy is threatened. And we should expect opposition. Just like what Nehemiah got in chapter 4. Look at this in chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Nehemiah receives this opposition, and it says, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Like, will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish it in a day? Why is he asking if they'll finish it in a day? Oh, yeah, because we've got all of this army around that if they don't finish it in a day, we'll just sneak in the other side and push it over again. Like, we can deal with this. Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Verse 3 actually goes on and it says that Tobiah the Ammonite, he piles on, he goes, what are they even building? If a fox jumped on it, that wall would break down. Like they're actually just continually kind of throwing shade. They're jabbing at Israelites and Nehemiah, and they're saying, what you're doing is ridiculous. Have you ever had somebody look at you and say, you are ridiculous? I don't know why you care about that. Don't you understand that is way too big of a problem? You're one person. What could you possibly do? Right? Like we feel this and it becomes so incredibly discouraging. And this is exactly what these men are trying to do. They're trying to discourage Nehemiah from doing the good work that he has in front of him. See, guys, if you're a Christ follower, if you are, stepping out to do something great for God, you need to expect opposition. In fact, if you're taking notes today, you need to write this down, put this in your mind, that you and we need to expect opposition. There will be haters, there will be critics, there will be spiritual enemies that want to stop the progress that you're making. And here's what we need to do. The big idea for today is that we need to learn how to defeat discouragement before it defeats us. We need to learn how to defeat discouragement before it defeats us. Why? Because discouragement is the enemy of progress. How many of you have known that, like, you've set up something in the beginning of the year, whether it's a diet, whether it's a life change, whatever it may be, and you're like, yeah, I'm going full force into this. I'm going to stop eating French fries. I'm going to stop drinking Coke, whatever. And then you're like, wait a second. I meet with too many people out for lunch. Like, I'm not going to order a salad all the time. And you start to talk yourself off of, like, the conviction that you have. And you start to be discouraged, and you recognize that discouragement keeps you from even taking that first step forward. Or maybe you've started to move forward, and you feel that opposition, you feel that pain, you feel that desire for what it is that you were doing, and you're like, forget this. This is too overwhelming. And discouragement keeps you from moving forward. Discouragement is a powerful tool. It is a powerful tool, and parents, you need to understand something. That you and I play a key role, a critical role in the life of our kids. And we have to be careful with the words that we use to encourage or discourage their growth. Because the same thing applies to our life. It's this powerful tool that Satan can use to disengage you and to cause you to feel disqualified from whatever God's Spirit has prompted you to do. Discouragement is actually the act of being discouraged, right? So what is the root of discourage? It's the idea that there's no courage left. There's just no courage. You have no courage. It's a lack of courage. Courage for what, though? For the issues that you need to face head on. For those things that you feel like God has laid on your heart, like, I've got to do this. And I can't do that. Like, that's too overwhelming, or that would take too much. What would they say about me? What would my wife say about me, right? And to stand in the face of all kinds of issues will require courage. What would it take to stand in the face of racial injustice in our world right now? Courage. You better believe it. What would it take to stand up for the little guy, the guy that's kind of down and out and pushed to the side, minimized? It would take courage. We have to be encouraged. We have to fill ourselves with courage to change our family tree. Courage to stay married and fight through the feelings and desire for divorce. Courage to love your rebellious teenager. See, discouragement can sneak in and it can defeat you before you're beginning, which is why we have to defeat discouragement first. If you're trying to rebuild your life and you're trying to step out and do something great for God, we need to expect outside opposition as well. Before I started Hope City Church, before we even had our first service, before we did absolutely anything in a public setting, I sat down with a whole ton of area church leaders, and we would meet over coffee or over lunch sometimes, and I just wanted to share with them my heart, what was going on, what God was putting on my heart for this city. We met with area leaders. We met with pastors in the state of Florida. We met with pastors around the country. We did anything we could to get people around us. And I remember this one guy who was like, hey, I'd love to take you out to lunch. And I was like, sounds great. I would love to go out and meet you for lunch, especially if you're buying. And so he was like, yeah, 100%. So meet me I'll never forget, we met at Sarasota Ale House. sat down, had a zinger salad. It was fantastic. And he looks across the table at me, and for the next 45 minutes, he began to just put me on blast about the problems with church plants. He put me on blast about how, like, well, how do I know that you're not going to steal all my people? And I was like, what? What are we even talking about? Like, this is not the way I thought this was going to go. I went home and told Tiffany, I was like, man, I didn't buy lunch, but I certainly paid for that one. Like, that was hard, right? Like, listen closely. Criticism is confirmation that you're on the right track. Anytime Christ followers step up to do something significant for God, you need to expect criticism. And it will come from the outside. We will expect outside criticism, just like Sanballat and Tobiah. You weak, feeble Jews, what do you think you're even doing? See, do you know how you can identify discouragement in your life? I think there's three things. As I look through my own life and as I look through people that I know, three ways that you can identify discouragement. And one is that you will experience extreme emotions. Like your emotions will just kind of be all over the place. And you might lash out in anger. You might just say things that you're like, where did that even come from, right? Like your emotions lead the way. Another thing is that you might experience a loss of motivation. That when you started this thing, when you started out, you were passionate about it. You were passionate about the conviction that you had, what God had placed on your heart. And yet for some reason, you're just like apathetic about it. I don't know. I'm not as into that anymore. Discouragement has set in. And another thing that happens when you're discouraged is that you lack courage. There's a lack of courage in your life. It can be something just as simple as saying, I just chickened out. Like I can't do it anymore. You step away from the plate rather than leaning into the plate. Like you just kind of are ready to just step back and get back in the batter's box than actually take a few swings. See, discouragement, it robs you of courage. But here's what I want us to hear today. That courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage isn't like, okay, that person has courage because they are fearless. Courage is the ability to master fear. It's the mastery over fear. It's saying, I'm waking up, I'm afraid, yes. I'm afraid, is this going to work? I'm afraid, like, is it going to even matter? But you have the ability to master that fear. And so whatever it is that you're afraid of right now, put that into mastery. Put that into a position where you overcome that fear and you just put it in its place. Because discouragement is like a gut punch in your spirit. It's no wonder that Solomon, one of the wisest men in the world, he wrote these words about discouragement. In Proverbs 18, verse 14, he says, the human spirit can endure in sickness, right? Like we can endure in the flu, broken bones. I think he's actually saying the female human spirit can endure in sickness. Men, that's a whole other issue. But a crushed spirit, who can bear it? A crushed spirit, who can bear it? The days that are the hardest to get out of bed aren't when you've got a sniffle. No, you can do it. You figure it out. You can deal with it. You'll kind of wear off throughout the day. The days that are the hardest to get out of bed are when you're like, I don't know if I can go on. My spirit is crushed. The very nature of who I am is challenged. And some of you are living in this space right now. And my heart breaks for yours because I know what this feels like. I know what it feels like to have a crushed spirit. Where you say, give me the flu, give me anything other than this. This is why we have to defeat discouragement before it defeats you, before it sucks out your will to accomplish things that God's put in your life, before we need to deal with this. And let me remind you that who was on Nehemiah's side? Who was living this out, kind of propping him up and getting him on his way? It's not King Artaxerxes. It's a much greater king. It's the king of the universe. See, on Nehemiah's side was God, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Nehemiah is reminding himself of that. If you're sitting here this morning and you're feeling discouraged, I want you to know that this message, it's for you. Your circumstances, they may look bleak. Your bank account may look bleak. Your relationships may look bleak. It's all discouraging, right? but you aren't defined by your circumstances. You aren't, your value in this world isn't defined by any of those things that I said. Your value in this world is defined by whose you are, by what family that you're a part of. You see, and as a Christ follower, as somebody that is identified as saying, I want to follow Jesus with my life, I've placed my faith in him and my trust in Jesus, then you and I have been adopted into the family of God. We have literally been brought into a different family. See, my last name is Goweski because I was born into the family tree of Jeff and Sarah Goweski, and I, because of that, have adopted certain practices, and I understand certain things because of the way that I was raised. You and I understand this well, but we've been brought into the family of God. And so those same words that God spoke to the Israelites through Joshua, where he says, be strong and courageous. Take courage. Maybe in your own wilderness right now of whatever you're walking through, you need to hear the same words. You need to hear me tell you, be strong, take courage. Why? Because the Lord is with you. God is on your side. God has your back for whatever it is that he's put on your heart. If he's put something on your heart, you better believe that he's also got your back. And that's the way that God works. God won't leave you there out to dry. Some of you have said in the past, you're like, I just need to catch a break. No, we don't need to catch a break. We need to increase our faith. We need to increase our trust. See, this is why Solomon says things, because we know that our spirit, a crushed spirit, can be overwhelming. All throughout Jesus' ministry, and especially at the end, he was mocked. He was taunted. He was threatened by a chorus of critics. And yet he never, not even 1 second, deviated from what God's plan was for his life. He never, not even for a second, did he say, it's not worth it. He had his heart and his mind set on the things that God had for him. He had his heart, his mind set on the mission of restoring you and I to a right relationship with our Heavenly Father, to bring us into that family. Because why? When you and I are in that family, we understand that there is nothing that cannot be accomplished. And see, this is exactly what Nehemiah does. He has his heart and his mind set on what God has for him. And when Tobiah starts kind of, ripping him apart, and when Sanballat starts slinging some nasty words, or when Nehemiah is being discouraged, the first thing that he does when you're being criticized is you and I, we need to do what Nehemiah did. We need to take it to God in prayer. One of the very first things, fundamentally, that when you are discouraged, take it to God in prayer. Bring whatever it is on your heart to the Lord. Nehemiah does this in verse 4 and 5. He received insults, he heard their curses, and decided to do just that. Look with me. He says to God, hear us, our God, for we're despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as a plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or block out their sins from your sight, for they've thrown insults in the face of the builders. I mean, Nehemiah is like spitting fire right now. This is a savage prayer. Nehemiah isn't holding back any punches. He's like, God, turn their insults on them. You take care of them, God, because I can't do this. That's not my role. That's not my responsibility. I love how raw and honest Nehemiah is. Is he discouraged? You better believe it. But what is he doing with it? He's telling God on them, right? Like he's not kind of taking it out on somebody else. He's taking it to God. When this kind of stuff happens in your life, what do? Are you tempted to just, you want to hit back? You want to sling some words? You want to say, oh yeah, but what about, or do you take it to God? See, instead, I want to encourage you to bring these things before God, because let me tell you, one of the most powerful things that a Christ follower can do is to bring those concerns to Jesus, because you are never more powerful than when you are fighting from your knees. You are never more powerful. You can't say anything more powerful than when it's put in from a posture of prayer. So in that divorce hearing, when it gets nasty with your ex, you go tell God on them, right? Instead of telling your friends and kind of spilling all these things, that's a Christ-like response. Or when someone at church, at work treats you unfairly, or at church if they treat you unfairly, instead of striking back, right? You need to bring them before God. Ask him to take up your cause. Because that's how Christians, they spiritually wage war with the enemy. You don't take revenge, you take it to God. The second thing that Nehemiah does, and this I want to encourage you to do this, after you've taken it to God in prayer, is get back to work. Nehemiah, he tells all these guys, he's like, all right, let's get back to work. let's be so focused on what God has put on your heart that we're just going to get right back to work. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep pushing. When opposition comes, we're going to keep pushing. Nehemiah prays, then he perseveres. Break time's over, back to building. Verse 6, he says, then we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. See, critics discourage, leaders encourage. Critics discourage, parents encourage. Critics will discourage you, and a spouse will continue to encourage, to prop you up, to say, I've got faith in you. You can do this. Get back to work. Right? Like, this is what my wife says every morning. She's like, get back to work. Get out there. Right? See, this is a picture of perseverance. Any leader will tell you this. Any coach will tell you this, that when you step out to do something great, when you step out to do something great for whether that's a team, whether that's your business, no matter what, but especially when you step out to do something great for God, there will always be, listen to me, there will always be a tap out moment before there's a tipping point. There will always be that point where like, this is too hard, it doesn't matter enough, nobody cares. Right before that tipping point. And we see this time and time and time again all throughout history. If you're trying to solve a business problem, or maybe you're trying to fix something broken in our world, or face the injustice of modern day slavery. See, you're saying this is too hard, it's bigger than I thought, it's too bleak, I didn't see it coming. And too many people lose heart. Their dreams die on the doorstep of destiny, like what could be. They just lay there lifeless. They tap out before the tipping point. Do not give up. Because if you keep pushing through, there's something incredible on the other side of that. See, guys, this is that critical moment in rebuilding your marriage. Don't throw in the towel when counseling gets tough. Catch your breath, get back right into it, and get to work. You know, if you're fighting to stay sober, if you're fighting to continue to keep these healthy patterns in your life, you know, there's old friends and patterns trying to pull you back in. Don't tap out. Continue to push through and persevere. Guys, this is where we are. This is where we are very often, in not only here at church, but in our own lives. There are moments when it's like, this is too much for me to handle. We have to defeat discouragement before it defeats you. Nehemiah, he had his criticisms, he has his critics, and he just got back to work. See, he had this prayer and perseverance. They worked hand in hand, and I want to encourage you to apply that principle in your life. That when outside opposition comes, bring it to the Lord in prayer and get back to work, prayer and perseverance. Now, you would say, yeah, Peter, I understand that. There's always going to be outside opposition. But it gets incredibly painful when the inside opposition comes around, when the people that you thought were on your team are actually the ones talking against you. See, Nehemiah saw this. He saw that there was people on the outside, right? They're very angry, and there's all these things that they're saying and doing. But look at what happens in verse 10. It says, meanwhile, the people in Judah, the strength of the laborers is giving out, he says. And there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. What's happening? Everybody is saying, this is too much. We got to stop. They're rebuilding the wall brick by brick, board by board, and they're making progress. But remember, this is a fixer-upper. Like the city walls look something like what modern-day Syria looks like, where you look at that and you say, this is beyond repair. Knock it down. Start over. Or just leave it. Let it alone. And see, this is what happens. Doubt, discouragement, and defeat start pouring into your life, which is a classic strategy of Satan. Remember that these are the people of God rebuilding the city of God, home to the temple of God. So this is spiritual warfare. The enemy of God, Satan, is trying to discourage God's people, and he's using inside opposition, which is part of the Christian life too. I want to share something personal with you that I've actually never shared this outside of my family and some of our overseers here. But in the early days of Hope City, there was a pastor outside of our city, outside of our network, that reached out to me, and he was like, hey, I'd love to chat with you, love to hear how things are going over at Hope City, and kind of follows me from afar on Facebook. And he said, I've got some ideas, I'd love to help. And so I drove up to his office, sat down next, across the desk from him, and he said to me, he goes, hey, so are you totally committed to this thing? He goes, because I'd hire you today if you wanted. If you want out, we could just this could be like your parachute. You could just fold it all up. And and move your family up here. And I've got to tell you, like, I had just poured out my heart to him, like, oh, this is what we're doing, and this is what we're about. Like, we are for Sarasota. We want to see people that are far from God, far from the church, that didn't like the church, maybe even hate the church, come back and find a relationship with God. And I'm telling him all these things, and he goes, hey, what about, like, you could come work here. It'd be easier. By the way, we don't set up and tear down every day. I literally walked out of that office sick to my stomach. Like I was a wreck. Not because of the meeting, but like, this is a person who's supposed to understand what it's like. Like, this is a person that I should say, like, if anybody identifies with me and what I'm doing, you would understand it. And it felt like from the inside, there was opposition to what we were doing. Understand something. That if you're going to do something, if you're going to move the ticker forward, if you're going to do something for God, the enemy will oppose you because he's threatened. Satan will whisper things in your ears. The accuser, that's what he's called, will accuse you of something like this. He'll say things like, who do you think you are to? And he'll just leave it blank because you'll fill in that. Who do you think you are to foster a child? Who do you think you are to help feed the homeless? Who do you think you are to mentor a middle schooler? I know who you were when you were in middle school. Who are you? Who do you think you are to be a stay-at-home dad or a businesswoman? You can't have an impact. Who do you think you are? And you have to understand a little bit that you have to push through the lies that Satan wants you to hear, because the enemy will accuse you and sow seeds of doubt and discouragement. And if you let that in, it will paralyze you. It will keep you from moving forward. It will keep you from doing that very thing that God has put on your heart. In 1 John 4:4, we understand that we have to push back with what God has already given us. Because in 1 John 4:4, it says, the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. The things that you and I experience, God is even greater than that. Which is why I want to encourage you this morning to step into what God has for your life, to remember the things that God has done in the past, and to take bold, courageous steps for the Lord this morning. God, I